Hi everyone, my name is Aaron and welcome back to my channel. L. Ron Hubbard did not pick David Miscavige to take over control of Scientology after his death. This is one of Miscavige's big secrets. To retain control, Miscavige relies in part on the fact that Scientologists think L. Ron Hubbard could do no wrong, and they believe they've been told that L. Ron Hubbard picked David Miscavige to be his successor. LRH didn't pick Miscavige at all. In fact, he picked another guy named Pat Broeker. In order to take over control of Scientology, Miscavige had to get rid of Pat Broeker and Pat's wife, Annie. One of the reasons the story of how Miscavige accomplished this is so interesting to me is because the story of how he did it is also the story that explains how and why Scientology is, at the end of the day, nothing but a scam. It's a very clever, intricate, well-designed scam. It's a scam that on some level is even capable of being helpful to a lot of people, meaning Scientologists do genuinely believe that Scientology is helpful to them. But the story of how Miscavige took over illustrates how, regardless of anything and everything Scientologists believe about L. Ron Hubbard and about Scientology, Scientology really is nothing more than a scam. I'm going to start with just the short version of this story, and if we have to go back over it and add in some more detail, then we will. Hubbard died in January 1986 while in seclusion. He had been in seclusion since around February 1980, so basically 6 years. Scientologists at the time were told that the reason Hubbard was in seclusion during this whole period was that he was working on his upper-level OT research. So here's a short description of what working on upper-level OT research means. So in Scientology, you have the bridge to total freedom. You've got the bottom half of the bridge that is called the lower-level, non-confidential part of the bridge. You have the upper half of the bridge that is the highly confidential part of the bridge that consists of the OT levels. OT refers to operating thetan. Thetan is Scientology's word for spirit, and Scientology believes that we are all thetans. Scientologists believe that as thetans, we are natively immortal and godlike. I do literally mean godlike. Operating in this case means operating as one would in native state. So if Scientologists believe that we are natively godlike, then an operating thetan would be a thetan that was acting that way, meaning they had regained the powers that they natively had trillions of years ago and lost through various things that we don't have to explain right now. Scientologists believe that it is doing these OT levels that L. Ron Hubbard created that will, on a progressive basis as you go up to the higher and higher levels, bring you closer and closer to your native godlike state. So again, I say godlike, and again, I do mean literally. So Scientologists believe, when L. Ron Hubbard is telling little anecdotes of what a real OT would do, or what he remembers doing trillions of years ago as an OT. I mean, he's talking about anecdotes like, you know, creating worlds and universes and stripping an atmosphere off of a planet just for fun, or, you know, to get down to the real nitty-gritty. Technically, thetans don't even exist in this physical universe. They exist outside of the physical universe. So Scientology sort of holds that thetans collectively exist in the theta universe and only choose to interact with the physical universe to have a game or to have something to do. Anyway, stories about this or explanations about this can get very, very funny and very interesting, but definitely what I want you to take away from all this is the concept of the OT levels, the promise of the OT levels. What Scientologists hope to accomplish on these OT levels is the promise of Scientology. If you ask a Scientologist what they're trying to achieve, obviously it would be a little embarrassing for someone to just look you in the eye and say, I'm trying to become a god. That's why Scientologists have a hard time explaining Scientology to non-Scientologists. There's not an honest and easy and not ridiculous sounding way to explain it in a nutshell. So that's how Hubbard's seclusion was explained to Scientologists. And it's what Scientology still claims to this day. He was in seclusion. He was working on his upper level OT research. Well, Pat Broeker and his wife Annie were two of some of the only people who had anything to do with L. Ron Hubbard during that 6-year period. Pat and Annie were with him the whole time. David Miscavige was not with Hubbard at all during this time. Miscavige had no contact with L. Ron Hubbard whatsoever. The only way Miscavige could have any contact with LRH was through Pat. Miscavige would meet up with Pat at different places. Pat would give Miscavige instructions from Hubbard. Miscavige would get information to forward. Miscavige would give Pat information to forward to Hubbard. And anyway, everything went through Pat. There was no succession plan for taking over after L. Ron Hubbard died. For some reason, it's sort of not how Scientology thinks. For an organization that prides itself on having like the best administrative and management technology that's ever existed in this sector of the universe, there really isn't any long-term planning in place for Scientology. This is true at the organizational level, the continental level, middle management, international management. It's a very neurotic organization that's only focused on like at most the next 3 to 6 months. So there was no succession plan in place whatsoever. There were not people competing to be, picked as the successor. None of that was even a thing back then. So Hubbard's off in seclusion. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what he's really doing, but there's a belief that he's working on these OT levels. And then shortly before Hubbard's death, and someone could look this up, it was either shortly before or shortly after, but to me the story makes more sense if it was shortly before. Hubbard put out an issue saying he was basically promoting himself to the position of admiral in the Sea Organization. Prior to that, he had always been referred to as the Commodore. He was promoting himself to admiral, and he was promoting Pat and Annie to the position of loyal officers. Loyal officers is never a thing that he's written about. There was no particular explanation for what that was supposed to mean. Loyal officers is a title that's included in Hubbard's OT3 story about Xenu and the Galactic Confederacy and stuff that I don't want to get into in this video. But the implication here was that he was naming Pat and Annie to take over control of all of Scientology from him. Now, I have to say implication because just like I commented a moment ago that long-term planning isn't really a thing in Scientology, apparently it wasn't a thing for L. Ron Hubbard either. The issue that he put out didn't even specifically say, and therefore Pat and Annie will be taking over full control of the church. It was still like an implied thing. Probably not the best thing to do when you're essentially turning over operations of a giant organization with hundreds of millions of dollars in play. Probably not a good idea to only imply who's supposed to be taking over, but that's what he did. Once Miscavige got wind that this issue had already been copied and distributed to basically everybody in the Sea Organization, he ordered people working for him to run around and gather up every copy of that issue and have it destroyed, and claims that that issue was, fraudulently authorized or issued or published. Nobody but Miscavige actually claims that, by the way. It was Miscavige solely being like, oh, this cannot be. So even though I said there wasn't particularly like a battle for who was going to be LRH's successor, we can clearly see that once Miscavige saw it wasn't going to be him, he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that was not the case. However, despite Miscavige's best efforts, Pat Broeker really did have an ace up his sleeve that allowed him to retain official control of the Church of Scientology. Everybody already believed that L. Ron Hubbard had spent the last 6 years working full-time intensively on his upper-level OT research. And then L. Ron Hubbard dies. So now guess who claims to be in possession of the entire body of upper-level OT research that Hubbard had done over that 6-year period? Pat Broeker. Claiming to be in sole possession of L. Ron Hubbard's unreleased upper-level OT research is how Pat Broeker was able to retain control over all of Scientology after Hubbard died. In order to steal control of the church from Pat, Miscavige had to figure out how to get his hands on the upper OT levels. And then once he had that, he could then get rid of Pat and Annie. Now, one thing that's kind of funny here is that Pat didn't actually want to run the church. Pat had just spent the last 6 years doing basically nothing but babysitting LRH. Miscavige had spent the last 6 years being a pretty important and plugged in and busy operative on the operations side of this Scientology story. So Miscavige was already used to doing the work. Pat was used to not doing the work. What Pat wanted to do was to be able to retain his lifestyle. And, during this seclusion period, they were living on this giant horse ranch in Creston, California. Pat had basically gotten used to just living like a millionaire. He was babysitting this decrepit gazillionaire and just basically living on all of LRH's money and running a horse farm. Here's a clip of Pat Broeker speaking at the event where they announced L. Ron Hubbard's death. Here he is claiming to be in possession of all of the unreleased OT levels and OT research.
OT9 and OT10 are also written up, finished. There are several other OT levels that it is my job to compile. It consists of taking what he has written and putting it essentially in paragraph form, adding the appropriate HCOB references that entail that go along with the auditing necessary to do this particular level, and they'll be released in due course. We have materials that are in this form in a thick sheaf of notes per folder of OT11, OT12, OT13, and so forth, and then about a stack this high to be sorted out for subsequent OT levels. He finished his job. There's not much else to say except that what he came to do, he did. Now that he's out there, now he embarks upon his further OT research at a completely new level.
That was lip-smacking spectacular. What a weird dude, huh? All right, so how did Dave get rid of Pat? I've heard this story a bunch of times from Mike Rinder, but I couldn't find a place where he's posted it on his blog or anything. So it's just a verbal story. I don't have something written to refer to. So what I'm going to do, I want to tell this story in Marty Rathbun's own words. Another reason I want to use Marty's own words is because Marty Rathbun has now done a deal with Miscavige where, for some undisclosed financial arrangement, now Scientology uses Marty as a trusted source to talk smack about all the people who left Scientology and then appeared on Leah Remini's TV show. So since Scientology is saying that Marty is now a trusted source of information, and since the article I'm about to read from still appears on Marty's blog, let's see what Marty Rathbun has to say about David Miscavige stealing control of Scientology away from Pat Broeker. Marty says, at the January 1986 L. Ron Hubbard funeral event, Pat Broeker announced that OT9 and OT10 were fully written up by Hubbard and ready for release. That was a blatant lie. 20 years later, David Miscavige told a collection of elite Scientology contributors that L. Ron Hubbard had written up OT9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. That was a whopping lie. Pat Broeker used the threat of never turning over the alleged OT9 and OT10 in an effort to get Miscavige to allow him to exercise control in Scientology, Inc. I was part of 3 separate forcible search and seizures Miscavige directed in order to get the alleged OT9 and 10 at Broeker hideouts. Each time we came up empty-handed and finally concluded there were no such things. This was validated by the senior technical officer of Scientology since L. Ron Hubbard's death, one Ray Midoff. Midoff audited Hubbard during the final week of his life. Midoff acknowledged in my presence that Hubbard had nothing intelligible to say about any levels that might exist above OT8, let alone gave any indication that anything had been written up about them. So that's what Marty has to say, and Scientology says Marty's a great guy. The version of the story that I've heard from Mike, and again, I might get it wrong, but the broad strokes of this thing are Pat had one or more warehouses where he had just stuff stored. And if I recall correctly, there was one particular warehouse that Miscavige had a high degree of certainty. This is the warehouse where Pat is alleging to have all of L. Ron Hubbard's research notes for the OT levels. And from what I recall, Pat was out of town, and this was a guarded warehouse. And basically, Miscavige and Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun and a bunch of other people whose names Scientologists would recognize pulled up to the warehouse with like some giant vans or trucks and said, look, we have an informant. We have been told that the FBI is about to conduct a raid on this warehouse. And if we don't get everything in this warehouse out, the feds are going to have their hands on the OT levels. We cannot allow this to occur. And that this is actually how Miscavige got at least what Pat was alleging was the OT levels. And anyway, once they had it, they went through everything, every scrap of paper, and there was nothing. Could you even imagine what was going through the heads of everyone involved in this at the time? Like, I got some good news and I got some bad news. The bad news is we don't have any OT levels. The good news is we can get rid of Pat and Annie. So after basically calling Pat's bluff, he had to admit he didn't have anything. And since he didn't have anything, he didn't have any stake or claim or right to keep spending LRH's money. I believe there was some financial arrangement where, you know, Pat was paid to just go away quietly. In prepping for this video, I couldn't find anything in writing to document that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So Miscavige sent Pat walking sometime in 1988 and then proceeded to have Pat followed by private investigators for the next 25 years. Miscavige knew that Pat Broeker could single-handedly destroy Miscavige's position of authority or control over this church, and the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars involved. These PIs started following Pat in 1988 and were still following him 25 years later in 2013 when, for some reason, Miscavige stopped paying them. In retaliation, there was a short period in 2013 when these PIs started talking to the press about the work they had been doing for Scientology. And then they came to some settlement with the church and went quiet again. But during that brief period, Tom Tobin at the Tampa Bay Times published some amazing information about what these PIs had to say. You have got to hear this. Here's some excerpts from the article. This is August 14th, 2013. The title is Two Detectives Describe Their Two-Decade Pursuit of an Exiled Scientology Leader. Nearly 25 years ago, the Church of Scientology hired two former California cops to do a job. Spy on Patrick D. Broeker. Church officials painted Broeker as an errand boy for the late Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard. They said he made off with $1.8 million and a cache of critically important Hubbard records. Follow Broeker, they said. Watch him every minute, report back frequently. Beginning in 1988 and continuing for a quarter of a century, Paul Merrick and Greg Arnold tracked Broeker from a California apartment to a cowboy town in Wyoming and even to the Czech Republic. They spied on his girlfriends, rifled through his garbage, and listened to his phone calls. After 14 months, high-ranking church leader Marty Rathbun told Merrick and Arnold that they had performed so well, the church would have work for them for the rest of their careers. The church started paying them $32,000 a month. It is a lengthy article, so I'm just going to keep reading some highlights. At the time, the church was at war with the IRS over losing its tax-exempt status. Actually, this is something many people don't know. Scientology used to have tax-exempt status back in the day. Then it was taken away. Then Miscavige got tax-exempt status for Scientology again in 1993. Scientology's tax-exempt status has already been revoked once. It can certainly be revoked again. A sensor placed on Broeker's truck helped to track his movements. Merrick and Arnold rented the unit next to Broeker's apartment and outfitted it with surveillance gear. They got Merrick's father to befriend Broeker and gave him a mobile phone, one that could be easily tracked with a police scanner. They listened to his conversations. They followed him on dates. They made a deal with a local trash hauler to get access to Broeker's garbage, an arrangement they said is common in the disposal industry. They used spotting scopes to watch Broeker come and go from his parents' house. 2 years into their assignment, both men began to believe that the church considered Broeker a threat to Miscavige's leadership. The church denies Miscavige's authority was ever in question. Well, Miscavige denies his authority was ever in question. Anyone else from the church says only what Miscavige tells them to say. In 1997, Broeker began to engage in what his followers termed covert behavior. They found indications in his trash that he was using aliases, buying security encryption software. He was in contact with former church spokesman Robert Vaughn Young, who had become a vocal critic. Was Broeker plotting a return? Through information brokers, the investigators obtained Broeker's phone records, an action that they say falls into a gray area and would not be legal today. They spotted a call on the phone records to an Ohio hotel where several high-profile Scientology critics had met. It's incredible the lengths that they went to. Later, they returned to Cheyenne following a tip that Broeker and Young would be meeting there. the investigators followed the two men to an Applebee's restaurant, where Arnold disguised himself and sat behind them in the next booth. He heard them talking critically about Miscavige and Scientology. Obviously, the church was still on their mind, and Pat was pretty angry. Broeker's involvement with the dissidents was short-lived. He moved to the Czech Republic. Come on now, a guy who spent his entire life in California and Colorado and Wyoming, all of a sudden ups and moves to the Czech Republic? That is really weird. At the church's direction, Merrick and Arnold worked on other investigations in the US while keeping tabs on Broeker from afar using foreign detectives. The men said Broeker spent nearly 10 years in the Czech Republic. So then during this time, Marty Rathbun leaves Scientology and becomes a critic himself, and these two PIs are assigned to spy on Marty Rathbun. And the PIs are quoted here as saying, "Wait a second, so now we're going to surveil the guy that hired us? This isn't really what we hired on for. Everything has changed." Spokeswoman Karen Powell said the church seeks intelligence on Rathbun and Mike Rinder because the church has an ongoing program to eliminate all relationships with people who worked with or are associated with Marty Rathbun or Mike Rinder. Incredible. So in these interviews, the PIs actually declined to say what city Pat Broeker currently lives in. As of this interview, Broeker was 64 years old. That would make him 72 years old now. So this brings us to what I meant earlier when I said Scientology is at the end of the day absolutely nothing more than a scam. Any Scientologist you talk to will be able to tell you, I would say genuinely and honestly, that they feel Scientology helps them. But people don't join Scientology, or maybe it would be more accurate to say, people don't stay in Scientology just because they think Scientology helps them. People stay in Scientology because they believe what they have been told about these upper OT levels. They believe in the existence of these levels. They believe in it because they're being told it by people who know it's not true. Pretty much every year at one of Scientology's international events, David Miscavige makes an announcement to all the Scientologists in the world that final preparations for OT 9 and 10 are being made, and he expects OT 9 and 10 to be released in the following year. He's been saying this pretty much every year for 20 or so years. Now, we can talk endlessly about all of the reasons why Scientology is bad, abusive, predatory. I know religious people are highly offended at the idea that Scientology would ever even be called a church. We can talk endlessly about whether Scientology meets the legal definition of a religion. But aside from all those conversations, in a very real and literal sense, Scientology is a giant scam. The people at the top, and it really is only the people at the top, the people in the C organization for the most part are not privy to this knowledge. But the people at the very, very top know that this promise of full OT, or these claims that Hubbard himself achieved this state of full OT, all of the stuff they say to keep Scientologists on the hook, that this thing that they've been promised not only was realized by L. Ron Hubbard, but is written up and available for them to do, and all of these gains are there for them to realize as well. It's an outright lie. Scientologists don't know that. Scientologists don't know that there are no upper OT levels. Scientology staff members don't know this. Scientology Sea Org members don't know this. Only a very select few people at the top know this. And this fact, and uncovering this fact, is actually what allowed Miscavige to take over full control of Scientology. And it wasn't just Pat Broeker that he had to get rid of. There were other people who had a lot of power in Scientology who Miscavige systematically had to eliminate them one by one. The Pat Broeker part of the story is one of the more interesting parts of the story. The others parts of the story, honestly, are a bit more sad. But these are Miscavige's two big secrets. One, he was not selected by L. Ron Hubbard to take over control of the church. Two, there are no upper OT levels. They do not exist, and it's why they haven't been released since 1986. All right, everyone, that's all I have on this subject. Please stay tuned to this channel for the updates on my soon-to-be campaign for City Council that will officially begin on September 16th. I hope you guys will join me for that ride, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye. I want to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Dream Realty. Oh, wait! That's me! I've been a real estate investor for over 20 years. I bought my first investment property when I was 20 years old. For the last 15 years, I've been buying and selling my own properties all over Clearwater and Tampa Bay. If you're looking to buy a home or sell a home and you'd like to work with me, get in touch and I'll get it done for you. Thanks again to everyone who supports this channel, and thank you for watching.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.